and I'd like to welcome everyone to the UK Centre of Excellence in In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation. This pilot series is proudly sponsored by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, or MRC, and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA. As the UK's first centre of its kind, we pioneered the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory innovation, and our webinars will delve into the latest advancements, best practices, and applications of in-silico approaches. We hope to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing amongst stakeholders, as you'll see today, so that we can drive progress in healthcare medical research. More broadly, we'll put some links as well on the webinar for you to join our network through the various channels that we have. And we hope that you can contribute well and get inspired from this pilot session. And thanks to the whole team from Pilot One. And I'll hand back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Lara. And thank you everyone for joining. We're coming from different sides of the world, so we're at a different time of the day to other pilots. And thank you everyone for bearing with us as we do that. And I'll just start sharing my screen now. And so we've got a number of collaborators who are working on this pilot. And is this working? Yes, okay. So the agenda that we have for this pilot, we're going to be looking at in-silico methods for the credibility assessment of carbon dioxide rebreathing in CPAP therapy for the treatment of obstructive sleep apnea. So I'll just introduce the pilot project quickly and give a bit of a background about obstructive sleep apnea and the therapy for it, CPAP, and then introduce the concept of carbon dioxide rebreathing. And then following that, we'll have a bit of a look at the ISO standard that covers CPAP masks and one of the tests that's described therein. And following that, we will jump into our ASME V40 risk-based framework, and we'll then essentially structure the rest of the presentation around that framework and work through that workflow. And we'll introduce two different approaches of modeling carbon dioxide rebreathing. One's with a computational fluid dynamics model, and then also a system model. And then finally, we'll loop around and come back and look at our credibility assessments, and then open the floor for questions. So first of all, I'll do some upfront thanks, but we'll come back to that again. But just to introduce you to the team that we have here. Myself, Andrew Sims. I'm a lead simulation engineer at ResMed, and have been there for quite a while now. And also helping co-lead this has been Tejas Kanchi, my colleague at ResMed. And then we also have a number of people who've contributed quite significantly. Wei-Sheng Chen, who's one of my colleagues in my team, and Eva, and Nev, who work closely with Tejas. And then we also have our other industry collaborator from Draeger, Hendrik, who'll be presenting some of our CFD work. And for our academia representatives, we have contributions from the University of Warwick and the University of Nottingham with Professor Declan Bates and Hussein Shamohamadi, and they'll be presenting some of our system modeling. And John Hardman from Nottingham has been involved in reviewing and providing some, a lot of advice along the way. And now for our regulatory representatives. That has been led by Leon Weeks from the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, along with his colleagues, Chloe Chen and Topeka Maxwell. And Mark Brumbridge from the MHRA has also been involved along the way. So thank you to everyone, and let's dive in. So the aim of our project is to demonstrate the protection against carbon dioxide rebreathing in a CPAP mask using in-silico methods, and then provide recommendations using a risk-based approach to establish the credibility of models simulating rebreathing. So here's a video demonstrating obstructive sleep apnea. So it's an atypical person, but it really strikingly highlights the issue. You can see there the negative pressure in the chest, The airway is obstructed. There's an effort to breathe, but you can't get a breath in. And then he's been able to open his airway, get some breaths, and he's been able to get a breath. And this cycle can repeat again and again. And so, just some terminology. Apnea. So that's a technical term, and like a simple definition of it is that it's a cessation of breathing for 10 seconds or greater duration. There are also some other conditions on it, but we'll refer to it as stopping breathing for 10 seconds or longer. And so in some people during sleep, we all have a reduction in muscle tone. And with this absence of muscle tone, that can lead to an airway collapse. And, this is often if there's in the presence of something which is crowding the airway or some anatomy causing that. But it can lead to an airway collapse, and it's quite common. And it can progress to complete obstruction, preventing rebreathing, as I find this video demonstrates really strikingly. And so if it's then obstructed its breathing, it's an obstructive apnea event. There are other types of apneas, but we'll just be dealing with obstructive apnea. And so then when that happens, you start getting increased carbon dioxide and not enough oxygen. Your body sort of rouses itself from the deeper levels of sleep, restores muscle tone, you can breathe. But then this can repeat again and again and again overnight. And you end up sleeping for hours on end, potentially, but getting very poor quality and non-refreshing sleep. And there are associations with a wide variety of health impacts. So what can we do about this? CPAP therapy. So ResMed commercialized CPAP therapy, and the foundational work was done by Colin Sullivan and collaborators out of the University of Sydney. And this was the original paper in 1981 in the Lancet. And he had the idea that if there's an something obstructing the airway, it's closing, why can't air pressure open it and hold it open like a balloon? And so he termed it a pneumatic splint, but with the application of a sealed mask or interface around the nose and mouth, and then the application of positive pressure to the airway, it essentially blows it up like a balloon, and then allowing the user to breathe normally on top of that positive pressure. And from this original paper, there was someone with severe obstructive sleep apnea, and this shows the oxygen saturation levels of them over 2 consecutive nights. The first night was untreated, and so getting their baseline, and that's desaturation from close to 100% down to like below 70% of oxygen, and that is going on for a long time. So he's really struggling to breathe a lot. And then the following night, with Colin Sullivan's device on, he's had that really nice flat line with open airway, able to breathe, and that was where the therapy started. So CPAP, it's often abbreviated to, and that's an acronym for continuous positive airway pressure. So there are various modes of doing it, but the simplest one is continuous. So you target a pressure, and then that pressure it's a positive pressure, and it maintains your airway patency. The general range is from sort of 3 or 4 up to about 20 centimeters. And so I've just put that in pascals underneath that. So now that we've got this, something that we're breathing on, we have to consider the concept of dead space and carbon dioxide rebreathing. So dead space is the volume of our breath that doesn't participate in gas exchange. So I'm showing on the right here a cross-section of the respiratory system, and we're highlighting the conducting portion of that. So that's essentially the conduits, so the pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi, branching down, but they're all involved in transporting the air into the lung, not the actual gas exchange itself. Um, and and there are various types of dead space. And what I'm showing here is the anatomical dead space, which is the volume of the conducting portion of the airway. There's also functional dead space, which we'll be interested in this talk, which is a modification to this based on putting an extra volume in front of your face or removing carbon dioxide from the volume, and that adjusts that to give a functional dead space. We'll be working with an approximate anatomical dead space of 140 mils in this study. And then we also need to mention as well, what are we breathing? Air. It's a mixture. And it's a mixture of primarily nitrogen, then oxygen, and then there are a whole bunch of other trace elements, but carbon dioxide is the other species that we're interested in. So in fresh air, that's something around about, so between 300 and 400 parts per million. So it's at tiny absolute levels for ambient air that we breathe in. But then from the respiration and gas exchange, we're breathing out air that's approximately 5% carbon dioxide. And that's approximately a partial pressure of about 38 millimeters of mercury. So if we have a tidal volume of roughly 500 milliliters, where the tidal volume is the total volume that you breathe in, the first, in this case, 140 mils of that is stale air. So we're rebreathing that air with its 5% carbon dioxide concentration before we start to now breathe in the fresh air. And so approximately the first third of what we breathe naturally is stale air. But if we now add something to our face, so a sealed mask in this case, and it needs to be sealed because we're going to pressurize it, and that will make it want to lift off the face. We've now increased that dead space. You can kind of think of it as well. It's similar to having a snorkel or something or a tube you're breathing down. What you breathe out, you're breathing back in, and you're increasing that dead space volume. So this is where the concept of functional dead space comes in. And this will result, compared to breathing under normal conditions, this will result in an increase in blood carbon dioxide levels and also your end tidal carbon dioxide level in your lungs. And consequently, you'll be rebreathing a bit more again. So we need to do something about that. And we need to exhaust air from the pressurized mask to remove carbon dioxide from the system and prevent excessive accumulation. So what are our motivations for wanting to look at in silico modeling and testing and for this pilot study? In one sense, it's a well-known, well-described test. ISO 17510 prescribes it, and that's an accepted test for demonstrating this capability. That test can be quite time-consuming. It's resource intensive. There are multiple configurations to consider, and then as well, if we're testing physical designs, these potentially have a long lead time as well and can be quite expensive to make. Computer modeling and simulation will allow these designs to be evaluated up front and then immediately simulated from design freeze or something like that. Another benefit from simulation is that it provides insight and understanding as well as results, particularly with things like CFD, which provides full field results. We can interrogate that and try and understand why we see what we see rather than just the numbers themselves. And computing resources are advancing all the time. They're scalable, and they're also reducing in cost. So looking into the future, they're going to be a good option as well. And again, looking into the future, I think these sort of techniques will be critical for personalized devices in the future. So thank you for that. I will hand over to Eva now.
Thank you, Andrew. So in the next few slides, I'll be describing the test method provided in ISO 17510. which actually explains how to measure the effectiveness of this CPAP therapy when it comes to the possibility of the CO₂ rebreathing, which is going to be problematic if not mentored properly, as described just now by Andrew. So technically, we would want to measure and calculate the relative increase of CO₂ in the mask system. So basically, the requirement given in the standard, let me just quickly read this off the standard to use the exact wording. So it says, yeah, the relative CO₂ increase in the normal use condition must not exceed 20% at minimum rated pressure of 5 and 10 centimeters of water. So can you just go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so for test description, as mentioned in the ISO standard, the increase of CO₂ will be measured using a simulated breathing setup, which is actually shown here in the diagram at the top right section of the slide. The picture right at the bottom is showing the sinusoidal breathing waveform, which will be uploaded into this breathing simulating machine, which is like a piston cylinder breathing machine, to kind of mimic the normal breath. So for this waveform, the tidal volume is around 500 milliliter with the inspiratory and expiratory ratio of 1 to 2, and the breath rate of around 15 beat per minute. So actually, that translates to actually each breathing cycle is going to last around 4 seconds, with 1/3 of it being in the inspiration and 2/3 of it being in the expiration phase. So you're actually using this sinusoidal profile, as I just mentioned, as opposed to the normal breathing profile. And the reason for that is because, firstly, it's been specified in the standard and is actually representing the worst case compared to the normal one. Can you just stay on the slide? I wanted to explain the test setup. So for the test setup, as you can see in the picture, we have the flow generator, which provides the pressure. For our case, it's around 3, 4, 5, and 10 centimeters of water. We also have the CO₂ supply with 99% of CO₂, which you can see here at the, I would say, far right-hand side, which is connected to this control valve. This control valve actually introduces CO₂ into the mixing tank of around 10 liter with a fan to actually ensure the good mix of the CO₂, which is then connected to the breathing machine that I explained just now. It actually uses the waveform that I just explained. And for this CO₂ valve shown here, it is obviously used to control the introduction of the CO₂, introduce the CO₂ until we reach the 5% volume fraction of CO₂ at the end of the tidal volume, where we are actually taking all of our measurements on, like at the end of the tidal volume. And that's equivalent to the partial pressure of CO₂ at the end of the tidal, which is around 38 or 40 millimeters of mercury. I guess you can now move to the next slide. Thanks, Andrew. So this was the setup that I just explained. Now we need to think about, how we're running the test. So if I want to describe the test method in a nutshell, yeah, as you can see in these two pictures, after we first need to put the baseline facial profile with no mask on with the simulated breathing machine, and introducing the CO₂ slightly as shown in the left side picture. And then we need to adjust the CO₂ input through the valve until getting the baseline end of tidal CO₂, which is equivalent to the partial pressure of CO₂ at the end of the tidal. Then in the next step, we're going to put the mask on, as you can see in the right picture, with or without the therapy, and trying to let the end of tidal CO₂ measurement to stabilize, and then we're recording all those measurements. After all those, we're removing the mask and trying to let the end of tidal CO₂ to return to the baseline. As a last step, we would also like to confirm that the baseline has not shifted too far. So calculating the average baseline and then the relative increase out of that. Also worth mentioning that, yeah, we can calculate the functional dead space afterwards by, weighing the rebreathed CO2 and the end of tidal pressure after putting the mask on. That was pretty much it about the setup. I'm gonna hand back to Andrew to cover the rest.
Thank you, Eva. So now we've had an introduction to the standard defined test. Let's now have a look at our risk-based framework from ASME V&V 40. So there's essentially a workflow here, which are represented in this flowchart, and this flowchart will guide essentially definitely this next section and the rest of this presentation. So we're going to start off with a question of interest, which will be specific and have a specific regulatory question that we want to answer. Then the context of use and assess model risk and so on. So let's step into it. So our question of interest. I'll read this one out, but when breathing under normal conditions using the device to provide CPAP therapy, does the relative carbon dioxide increase exceed 20% over natural breathing in ambient conditions when tested at the minimum rate of pressure, 5 centimeters of water or 10 centimeters of water? And with that question in mind, we then move on to define our context of use. So we're proposing that computer modeling and simulation techniques will be used as a surrogate for bench testing for the purposes of this pilot. So the ISO standard, it describes a test, a method, the boundary conditions, and prescribed limits. And so it's a good candidate for surrogate simulation. So that's what we thought we would do. And we have access to some bench testing rigs that can be used for validation to improve the credibility here. And so that leads us to two contexts of use. One is with a computational fluid dynamics model, and another is with a lump parameter system model. And these are complementary, and they're two different ways of addressing the same problem. Much of the credibility factors that we're going to address are going to be quite similar. Some will be different, but it's looking at the same problem, using different techniques in a different way. And one thing we've tried to do in this study is instead of just planning it out, we've tried to do some of it as well. So we've gone through and developed some CFD modeling, and we also have a lump parameter model, and we'll look at some results from there. Obviously, they're incomplete in terms of providing whole evidence, but we've used them to get the concepts across and show how it might work in practice. So let's consider our model risk. So I mentioned just before that in our context, we were proposing this as a surrogate model. So in that case, our model influence is extremely high. It's extremely important in the regulatory decision that we make. And so we've given that basically our highest classification on model influence. So it's a controlling factor. And then we considered the decision consequence. And we came to the conclusion that decision consequence was moderate. So some of the hazards to the user could be, if we got it wrong, they would not be venting enough CO2. They could potentially become hypercapnic, have too much carbon dioxide, or hypoxic, and if they weren't breathing and we weren't effective in delivering therapy. So we assessed those risks as potentially being unlikely, but relatively high. So that came out at a moderate consequence level. And when we combine the two of them, that puts us at a high level of model risk, which will influence how we establish our credibility goals, which we'll get onto now. Now, this slide is a little overwhelming, but we've tried to capture things as best we can. I'm not going to talk about this too much now because we will come back to this later on when we assess our credibility. But enough to say that we consider verification, validation, and applicability. And we have considered these for both our CFD model, which are the blue slider bars, and the systems model, which are our green slider bars. In most cases, they're similar, they're the same, but in some cases they differ a little bit. And where we have some check marks, that's where we've done some of the, in the development of this process, we've done some of these actual tasks along the way, or at least done enough of them to show what it might look like. Those scales are essentially normalized so that you'd often have a gradation scale for each factor, so a higher level of rigor would require more effort in demonstrating you've met that credibility factor. And we've essentially gone through, and for the most part, we've taken the suggested gradations or example gradations from V&V 40, and then we've chosen where we think we should fit on that, and that gives us the slider bars. So obviously, some of the solid ones down the bottom, we think they're more important, and we need to do them with more rigor than some of the ones that just happen to be up the top, like some of the numerical code verification. We'll come back to this later on. So we'll now look at once we've established those goals and we have the context of how much detail and so on we need to put into it, we can plan our models. And those credibility goals are very similar, but slightly different for both the CFD and the system model. And the CFD model is able to provide us with detailed spatial and temporal flow modeling. And it also means we can directly model the species transport with convection and diffusion through the transport equations. And this can replicate the bench tests really closely. And then it also provides really intuitive graphical field data, which can provide some insight into our design along with the numerical data. The system model, on the other hand, comes at it from a different way, whereas that's a sophisticated representation of an entire system. And in this case, it includes patient models. And it doesn't use detailed transport equations. So for instance, fluid flow would be considered as plug flow, and everything would always be ideally mixed. In the future, this could be enhanced to include physiological responses. But one of the great strengths of the system model as well is it's quick to run and can be very easily parameterized. And that can allow sensitivity studies to be really feasible and help build credibility quickly. So in terms of actually doing this, so we needed to go about and build these models. So we needed to source some CAD and facial geometry, measured what the plenum volumes were in our system, then prepare the actual internal volume, because we have two different things to make our domain. And then that once we had that sort of pre-work done, it was ready to traditionally pre-process, so develop our mesh and so on. And as a general rule, we would add complexity incrementally as we build a model up. And then once we've got some numbers, we would solve it and review it. And there's also the opportunity for a tuning step, which we have done in the case of the CFD model, where manufacturing tolerances on the vent holes, for instance, could mean that our targeted flow rate isn't quite right. And so we have looked at exploring matching the flow rate. But we'll now consider the system model. For that, we needed to identify the system components and how these might be augmented to a model. And then these needed to be adjusted to make sure that they were commensurate with the test. And that had a sort of review step in it to make sure that we're in the same ballpark and that we're replicating the test appropriately. And then once these were adjusted and prepared, in particular, getting the breathing profile in to match the sinusoidal profile. That was then ready for solving review, and we then had the opportunity to have a look at some sensitivities as well. So I will now hand over to Hendrik from Draeger, and he will talk us through some of our CFD model.
So now you should be able to hear me.
Yes.
Yeah,
I've got you.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a little bit of time to talk about our general domain and how it's all set up to be as near as at the bench test as possible with all the details we want to capture in this field. So our domain is built up out of a breathing tube, which is, Andrew, can you click through so we can see the highlights with this? Exactly, this is the breathing tube, which is connected to the pressure generator at the bench test of ISO 17510. It has some elongation to be able to breathe into it again in the moment where the pressure in the mask could be higher than the pressure at the end of the flow tube. So just to be able to capture these phenomena. Then over one elbow, it is connected to our mask manifold, which is basically built up out of the void volume between the face of the patient or the recipient of the therapy and the chassis of the mask. This is connected to the nasal cavity of the patient, and it vents to the ambient volume in the computational domain. Yeah, exactly. This nasal cavity, sorry, Andrew, can you go back a little bit? Yeah, the nasal cavity is corresponding to the 140 milliliters of anatomical dead space inside the patient, and the end of this tube is basically our theoretical interface to the lung. The ambient volume is depicted as a dome around our computational mask domain, which is vented to through the venting holes of the mask chassis, and its distance is basically maintained to the mask so that the boundary condition outside of the computational domain doesn't really affect the flow here. So we're sufficiently far away. Andrew also highlighted that our sensor location is basically a plane in the cavity tube, which is corresponding to the distance between the nasal interface on the face in the mask volume to the sensor location in the test bench, such that latence times from fluid moving from the nasal through the tube downwards will be corresponding to the physical representation in reality. Now, could you move to the next slide, please? So for the boundary conditions, here at the end of this tube, we can put pressures with a pressure inlet, which will correspond to the targeted therapy pressure, and mole fraction of CO₂, which will be corresponding to the ambient mole fraction, like Andrews told in the beginning, between 3 and 4 for 300, 400 ppm. Then the lung inlet, there will be the sinusoidal flow profile put on via velocity inlet, which will correspond to ISO 17510, with a mole fraction of CO₂, which corresponds to the exhaled mole fraction of a standard or median human of 5% in volume. And then there's the last boundary condition we need to clarify here, which will have a ambient pressure or relative pressure of 0 milliliters H2O, the outer dome of our outlet domain, also with a mole fraction of ambient CO₂ levels. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, then from the general extents of the domain, more towards the detailing of the discretization. So just to be able to have a look at which refinement levels or which details the mesh should have, we have run one preliminary computation on a rather coarse mesh, which showed that in the inlet and outlet tubes, the flow would be for the most time rather structured and linear. So we opted here in the end to give it a little bit less of attention in the mesh refinement. What got a little bit more attention would be the areas where we have unstructured flow, like the mask chassis, and especially the regions where the velocity is highest, which would be the venting holes to ambient, which we can basically see on the next slides. So Andrew, could you jump one further? So this is one of an example mesh, which would be, please remove the last picture again. Thank you very much. Which would be resulting for a computation like this. As you can see, this would be rather coarse at the outlet domain, where the flow is not really of much interest to us, where we would refine, or one should refine, the mesh itself is inside the chassis domain, where the flow basically in regard to each cell could come from each direction, because you have a huge amount of mixing there. So small polygonal cells should be the best choice here. And what we also especially refined are the very detailed venting holes, because those, with their pressure generated across the free jet going into the outside domain, will basically define how much air is vented to the outside of the mask, and therefore will be significant for the CO₂ levels inside, which will then be significant for the result of the computation. Please keep in mind that for this particular example, the mesh is still rather coarse, because we wanted to just give an example how this should be or could be executed. And for an extra submission, one maybe should be a little bit finer in the end. This has been rather really an economized mesh of something which could look somewhat like one would expect it to be discretized in the end. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. With this, I'm going to put the attention back to Andrew. Thank you. You're still muted, Andrew?
Sorry, I was muted. I'd started talking, but okay, thank you, Hendrik. And so with that model set up, we're able to run an example CFD, and we'll just have a look at some of the sensibility things as we went through it. So we kept track of how it was converging through time, and generally, for the most part, it was converging in 10 to 15 iterations at each time step. So we're generally pretty happy with that. And also, we're checking to see the volume of air that was going in from the lung. So we have integrated our lung flow boundary condition and just checked that it's up at 500 milliliters. And you can see we've highlighted exhalation and inhalation with different shading. And those are some sensibleness checks as we solved it. Oops, where's my mouse focus has gone? Okay, so now some results. I'll let these play for a little while, but the left-hand side, we have, that's probably playing a little bit quick, but the left-hand side, we see a breath cycle. So exhale, where the carbon dioxide rich air comes in through the airway tube, and you can see that it sort of sort of mixes into the plenum chamber, and then you can see it goes out the vent, and you can see the increase of carbon dioxide out here. So the color scale on the left-hand one is mole fraction of carbon dioxide, and yeah, so we can get a feel for where the carbon dioxide is coming and going. Now the vent itself on this, it goes right around that elbow connection, and there are a large number of holes, so it's diffusing right the way out. And on the right-hand side, we're visualizing the velocity field. So in this case, highlighting the sort of the unsteady flow and the flow in and out through the airway tube and the flow generator tube. and the interaction between them. But most importantly, we can see that there's a flow coming out through the vents. You can sort of see near just above the elbow that there is a higher density and color there. So coming around from the vents, the flow rate there is coming through at about 25 meters per second from memory. So it's saturated the color in around there. So let's look at the same thing now with some contours, looking at the midplane. So remember, this is happening in 3 dimensions, but if we have a look down the midplane, we can see exhaling. So there is carbon dioxide rich air coming into the tube that then mixes in the chamber, and you can see that it then goes out through the vent, and some of it gets drawn back in on the next breath. And on the right-hand side, you can sort of see the interaction of the flows from the flow generator and how the venting fluctuates a little bit, but it's continually venting through there. And there's some interesting little things like a Coanda effect on this running right down the tube with that little bit of flow attaching to the wall. So that's great. That gives us understanding of what's happening. But we're after some harder numbers. So we defined some measures and reports in our CFD package, and then we set up the model to run for three breaths. And so the first breath, essentially, it was initialized from a steady state model, and then we introduced transient flow from a breath pause moment, which corresponds pretty much to the steady state, where as you switch from inhalation to exhalation, you have a flow rate of 0 or velocity of 0 at that instant. And so we used that as our initialization point. And we started off with exhalation. So we delivered carbon dioxide into the system, and it sort of primed on the first breath. And the second breath was a little bit different. And the third breath, it began to converge, and then subsequent breaths were sort of fell on top of each other in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide we breathed in. So the top graph shows the volume flow rate of the carbon dioxide species past our sensor location. And you can see it's offset a little bit because it's not actually at the boundary. It's offset in the tube. So anything that comes in, it has to travel down there before it the effect of it is brought onto that sensor. And so during inhalation, the velocity, as we switch over to inhalation, the velocity is 0, but then you have rich air coming through quickly. And so we get up this spike quite early. But then as that spike goes through and you start breathing fresh air in past the sensor, it tapers off. And then at the sensor location, we tracked that, and then as a post-processing step, integrated that up to get a total volume of carbon dioxide that we breathed in. And we reported the breath of the volume from the third breath. And so knowing how much carbon dioxide we've breathed in, we're able to relate that to the functional dead space, which is also related to the carbon dioxide increment. And so we can approximate our rebreathed carbon dioxide at 8.6%. The bench test gave us 6.3 at corresponding settings. And I will now I might just mention that 3 centimeters there, that's was chosen as a worst case. So there's less pressure and flow, and it's generally seen as a worst case. So I will hand over to Declan to talk about the system model now.
Thank you, Andrew. Next slide, please. So this, excuse me, this slide shows a sort of cartoon schematic of the simulator that we're using in the study. The simulator has been under development in our group now for more than 20 years, and mostly we've been using it to do research into mechanical ventilation of patients with respiratory failure, either invasive or non-invasive. And it basically simulates at a particular level of resolution gas and fluid flows within the patient as a result of both the external respiratory support, whether that's from a mechanical ventilator or a CPAP machine or whatever, combined with their own spontaneous respiratory efforts. And what this allows us to do is to calculate the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood of the patient as a result of the resulting gas exchange. On to the next slide, Andrew, please. So using this simulator, we are able to create digital twins of patients by matching the parameters of the simulator to detailed data sets from actual patients. And we've done that in a variety of different conditions in previous studies, looking at various different kinds of respiratory disease. And the bottom of the slide here are just some recent publications from the group where we've successfully created cohorts of digital twins to investigate either high-flow nasal cannula therapy or non-invasive ventilation in patients with different respiratory conditions. So we're quite practiced now at developing digital twins of patients. But if you go to the next slide, Andrew, in this case, we're not looking at patients with respiratory disease. Their lungs are generally healthy. So the first thing we needed to do was to find some data on patients with healthy lungs. So fortunately, we had already done some work on matching the simulator to patients from a study that looked at the effects of high-flow nasal cannula therapy in healthy volunteers. So this study from 2015 provides a lot of detailed data for 6 healthy subjects that were used in the experiments. So the table here gives you a sort of overview of the means and ranges of various parameters across this cohort of 6 patients. So these were the patient data that we used to develop the digital twins that were used in this study here. Next slide, please. So although our simulator normally simulates humans, in this case, we're trying to actually simulate a mechanical bench test rig. So we needed to do some tailoring of the simulator to take that into account. So the first thing we had to do was to alter the breathing pattern that's implemented in the simulator. The normal breathing pattern we use is shown in the top graph there, which is based on data from actual subjects in experimental studies. And so we altered that to the sinusoidal flow pattern that's implemented in the actual test rig, which is, as you can see, a kind of simplified version of the real breathing pattern. And then we fixed certain parameters like IE ratio and respiratory rate in the simulator to match those implemented in the test rig. Normally, in our simulator, we would expect to vary the tidal volume with the level of pressure and the external respiratory support that's received by the patient, because that's what has been seen in actual clinical studies. But again, in the test rig, the tidal volume is kept constant across different CPAP pressures. So again, we adjusted the simulated respiratory muscle effort in our simulator to keep the tidal volume constant across all different pressures. And then we altered slightly some of the metabolic parameters in the model in order to generate the levels of CO2 at baseline that were observed in the test rig. And just a note there that this required slightly higher than normal values of things like oxygen consumption, etc. But again, that's what's being tested in the test rig. Next slide, please. So here are some results. We're showing here averages over the 6 subjects that were simulated. And it's again a complete cycle of inhalation and exhalation. And the top center graph here shows the baseline CO2 fraction, so without any CPAP therapy. And then the other graphs show the corresponding CO2 fraction at different CPAP pressures. What you notice is that the CO2 fraction increases once CPAP therapy is applied at 3 centimeters of water. But as you increase the CPAP pressure, there isn't a major difference in the CO2 fraction across those different pressures. So this slide shows CO2 fraction. The next slide shows CO2 pressure. And again, we see a similar pattern there, as you would expect. So if you go to the next slide, Andrew, we can show the actual numbers. So here are the end-tidal CO2 pressures for baseline and the different CPAP pressures for each of the different 6 subjects, and then their means and standard deviations. So there's a perfectly rational physiological explanation for why in these simulations CO2 remains constant across the different CPAP pressures. And the key reasons are that we're keeping tidal volume constant, so the flow rate is maintained at different CPAP pressures. We have stable metabolic parameters also as well across different external pressures. And then we have, as a result, adequate ventilation. So we have sufficient fresh gas flow from the CPAP device, and the mass volume exceeds the anatomical dead space. So therefore, as we would expect, the gas fractions are basically stable across different CPAP pressures. Next slide, please. So in comparison with the bench test then, this table shows the bench test CO2 pressure values for each of the different CPAP pressures and the corresponding average across the 6 patients for the digital twins. So as you can see, we have a maximum deviation of just over 6% in terms of the simulated pressures versus the measured pressures for the bench test. And in terms of the increase in CO2 pressure versus baseline, again, you can see that we have quite close correspondence between the bench test and the simulation results here shown on the table on the right. The actual specification is that there should be a maximum increase in end-tidal CO2 pressure of 20%. The maximum prediction from the simulator here is 7.13%, so well within that specified limit. Next slide, please. So we were also able to run a few sensitivity analyses that are also specified in the ISO standard tests. So there's a specification to analyze the effect of temperature variations within plus or minus 3 degrees Celsius. When we implemented that in the simulator, we found that it didn't change end-tidal CO2 by more than 0.1 millimeters of mercury in any case. There's also the potential for dead space volume variation. So we're using 140 milliliters as a baseline, but there's also a potential variation of plus or minus 5 milliliters around that. I suppose that's just related to anatomical variations amongst different people. And so what we were able to establish by implementing that level of variation was that the end tidal CO2 rises by about 0.5 millimeters of mercury for every 5 mil increase in dead space volume. So again, a very small change. And then the last thing we looked at was changes in mask volume due to potential looser or tighter fits, which can correspond to up to plus 10 or minus 15 milliliters of difference in the mask volume. And again, we could detect no measurable change in CO2 pressure for that level of variation. So all those variations look like they do not produce any problematic additional CO2 pressures under the stated assumptions. And I think that's the end of our results, and I'll hand back to Andrew.
Thank you, Declan. So we'll now turn our attention to credibility assessment. So we've previously introduced our credibility goals, and Tejas will now talk us through our assessment against those.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So like we have seen through this presentation, that we've gone through almost the structure of the ASME VNV40 in sort of laying out the groundwork for essentially what is the credibility assessment in the sense of a regulatory submission, which becomes very important. So credibility assessment, we would sort of define as our structured process for demonstrating that the models we use are reliable, appropriate, fit for purpose. So like we've done so, we are using the ASME VNV40 framework and evaluate each of these models, both the CFT model and the systems model, across verification, validation, and applicability factors, which are sort of laid out in this table, ensuring that the level of rigor is proportional to the risk of the decision. So we've been talking about risk. We've laid out all the different computations from both the CFT side and system side. So the risk of the decision sort of will inform the regulatory risk of this entire process, so to say. So this approach also allows us to transparently justify or lay out the credibility factors, assumptions, quantify uncertainty, and show that our results can be trusted for regulatory and design decision making. So yeah, you've seen this table before. What we have done here is laid out the credibility factors from VNV40. So VNV40 lays out these under large sections of verification and validation, but also details it under code verification, calculation verifications, the details regarding the computational model, its uncertainty, the inputs, the outputs, also the comparison with the bench test, which is what we're doing here. For a very specific bench test, which is laid out in the ISO 17510, and the assessments, which are the equivalency of input, the output comparisons, the quantity of them, the uncertainty related to that, and also the relevance of the quantities of interest. So what we have done in this table is based on the VNV40, which has different levels that are defined. We have laid out what, in our context of this pilot, is the required level of credibility that would be needed for a regulatory submission. So those are the color bars you see that we have assessed based on all the work we've done. And that's for both the CFT model and the systems model. So, and you see in the column saying status, we have been able to sort of carry out some of these credibility assessments through the work which has now been presented from both sides, which is the systems model as well as the CFT model. And also we've mentioned what is the plan and evidence that would be required in the case of a regulatory submission that would need to be submitted to a regulatory agency. So you see that this is a very long list of a lot of credibility factors which would need to be looked at, which is very comprehensive. But what I'll do is essentially look at a few things and compare the CFT model and the systems model and lay out what we think should be the credibility assessment and also what we have done in each case. So Andrew, if you can go to the first slide. Yeah. So one of the important things that we would be looking at is the numerical code verification, because you're in the sense of In-Silico, you're using numerical methods, governing equations, both on the CFT side, which are the Navier-Stokes equations, and on the system side as well, the governing equations relevant to the physiological model. So this would become very important. So when we are comparing the CFT model and the systems model in the credibility context, we see that the CFT model, which uses ANSYS in this case, has a strong baseline numerical code verification because it's a commercial solver which is pre-verified and has built-in confidence for fundamental numerical correctness and has been used for a variety of applications prior. On the systems modeling side, it is a custom code, but uses a platform which has been verified and has high confidence, such as MATLAB. But also it would require a level of scrutiny, such as, for example, laid out in the IEC 62304 software lifecycle standard, where an independent verification for regulatory use, because due to its bespoke nature, and would be needed. So on the CFT side, what we have done in the case of numerical code verification is, to the extent possible, we have looked at what factors affect the verification, the changes in verification. So this would be essentially mesh convergence and temporal convergence, and that in this project we haven't really fully completed it, but we are confident to an extent that we have been able to report the results you have seen here before. And what on the system side, prior NCV has been done, like Declan just mentioned in the literature that has been published from his group. So if you go to the next slide, Andrew. Yeah, similarly, a calculation verification in the VNV40 is laid out in terms of discretization error, solver error, use error. So I'm just picking one of them as discretization error. And again, comparing both sides where we have standard discretization and solver error considerations, like I mentioned before, which is gradient dependence. And on the system model, because it's a lumped parameter architecture, the grid convergence does not apply. So, but the temporal resolution definitely does apply, because like you've seen in the waveforms that have been used in the physiological systems model, it does become important. And on our side, on the CFT model side, you will see that the temporal discretization has to be considered because it's a transient simulation, which is again we haven't fully completed, but we do have a fair idea of where we stand in terms of the temporal variation in the simulation. Next slide, Andrew. Yeah, again, model inputs, which comes out in the validation aspect of that credibility assessment table, and the quantification of sensitivity and uncertainty is another very important aspect, where in the CFT model, we stand at a rigor level of about medium to high, where we've selected key variables such as temperature, viscosity, flow rate. And the sensitivity, again, we haven't really performed the sensitivity, but we do understand where we stand in terms of what is needed for a full regulatory submission. This would involve having a Pareto sort and rank, and to quantify the uncertainty, we might use something like a Monte Carlo method. But an important point is that the bench test actually accounts for uncertainty here, because the inherent instrument accuracies are quantified in terms of uncertainty. So because that the bench test is used for regulatory submissions. So the uncertainty is inherent, but the computational model uncertainty is something we need to estimate separately as well, in addition to it. So on the system model side, it's as per the CFT model for sensitivity and uncertainty. But the sensitivity on temperature was performed from the systems modeling side, where temperature was varied for plus or minus 3 degrees Celsius. And sorry. Yeah, so yeah, and then that was estimated. So next slide. Yeah, again, equivalency of output parameters. We see the safety model as being and the systems model as having high rigor level, where the bench test output, which is essentially the percentage of entitled CO2, has been replicated in the output parameters from both the systems and the safety model side, but slightly in a slightly different manner. So the systems model is actually able to replicate it equivalently, but in the safety model, we've had to calculate, like it has been mentioned before, where we've looked at the volume of CO2 rebreathed and the functional dead space, and there is a relationship between that. And then that's how the relationship and the parameter has been extracted. So it's slightly different in the systems and the safety approach. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, agreement of output comparison, again, it's very important, where we stand in terms of the performed output is we stand at a medium level, where the considerations have been that the model has to be flow tuned and some of the key output parameters shall match within the acceptable tolerance. So if you see the plot which lays out all the test parameters, the system model, as well as the worst case parameter from the CFT, which is the 3 centimeter simulation, we are well within the limits. So the acceptance, essentially, that what we would define is that it accounts for the 20% threshold limit, and it's very much clear from that. So which means we are within the tolerance of the regulatory requirements as well for a potential regulatory submission. So even though you see that there is a slight variation from the system model and the test and the CFT, we are well within bounds. So that's an important consideration. So yeah, just to sort of finalize or summarize the, if you go to the next slide, Andrew, sir. Yeah, an overall summary of the CFT, I just picked out a few aspects where the CFT model and the systems model compare. We say that the CFT model has a strong base quality assurance on software due to it being a commercial solver. The system model is strong where inputs and comparator measurements are dominating, which has been demonstrated. The CFT model shows high potential fidelity. Like, again, we have seen that the field distributions of parameters can be very clearly can be seen at high fidelity. But the systems model also fits well within the COU, which is the context of use of understanding what's the CO2 rebreathe in the physiological system. Some of the gaps we want to lay out as well, where the discretization rigor, the solver sensitivity, comparator equivalency, which I've just mentioned, and output agreement. So some of those things which we would need to work on. So this is specific to what work has been done in this pilot. And in the systems model side, the quality assurance is limited in the sense that it has to be independently verified, but they can be addressed via a dedicated V&V process for an actual regulatory submission. So, and potentially CFT has unresolved anomalies which could crop up. So that is something that needs to be considered on the CFT simulation side. So yeah, overall, that would lay out the credibility framework in the context of VNV40. So I'll hand it back to Andrew. Thanks.
Thank you, Tejas, and everyone. And let's just wrap this presentation up. So from this, we've presented the ISO 17510 bench test and shown that under normal conditions that we've been able to replicate the bench test results in several different ways. And we considered both the computational fluid dynamics model with its high fidelity, full field solution, and digital twin-based system model. And both have their own strengths and limitations, which I've so identified some of in that table. But we'd like to state quite clearly that both these approaches are complementary, and they each help each other out and work together to increase credibility in silico methods for this problem. And where might this go in the future? So, well, we can continue to potentially increase the physiological realism, particularly beyond what's in the current test here. But I would just have to say that's slightly out of scope of the particular looking at this test as defined in the standard. But there is a very high ceiling of where we can take this in the future, and incorporating the things like the respiratory drive from the physiological models that Declan mentioned, and some of those more complex patient characteristics. And then we can also look, once we can do or have acceptance of sort of in silico patients and so on, then that opens the door for more personalized devices, medicine, and assessment. And at this point, I would like to say thank you to everyone who's contributed to putting this body of work together. So quickly just run through the names of our core group. So thank you to Tejas, Hendrik, and Wei Sheng in particular for a lot of the CFD work that was done, and Tejas pulling a lot of the credibility stuff together. Eva for a lot of work on the lab work and the V side. And then, of course, Declan and Hussein for their system modeling, and John for his advice, and then the incredible collaboration from the TGA in particular, but also Mark from the MHRA. And I would also like to say thank you to Alex and Mark and Steve in particular. There are plenty of others involved in the whole project, but Alex as main coordinator, and Mark and Steve for touching base along the way and providing some advice and sounding boards. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone, and hand back to Lara and questions and discussions, however we go from here.
Hi, so just if anyone wants to post questions in the chat, we've got about, let's see, about 45 minutes left. Or people are free to speak up as well if you have a question that you wanted to ask. Yep, Joyce.
Was that for me, Lara?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. This is a question from a non-expert in this area, so forgive me if it's naive. I noticed that you said about halfway through that what was needed for your development of the CFD model was quite a bit more time-consuming and onerous compared to what was needed for the system model. But I presume that's because you've already got 20 years worth of work on your system model. How do you think that balance would play out with another group with a different, perhaps more complex device that didn't already have the system model in place?
I think we were in a beneficial situation where we had a system model there, and if that was worded poorly, that I'd apologize for that. But there's an awful lot of work that's gone into them, but
Yeah.
having the system model available, they solve quickly, and so some of those iterations are very, very quick.
Yeah.
The CFD model, there's a lot of work for each one to get them set up, and then you have a fairly heavy burden on the actual solving time. So I think that sort of example one that we showed there, that was solving for, I think, best part of 24 hours to generate the data in this case, whereas
Yeah.
Declan could probably correct me, but those models, once they're prepared, they run in seconds to minutes. Maybe Declan, you could make a comment on that.
I'm not thinking of the time it takes to run the model. I'm thinking of the time it takes to develop the model in the first place. And if you're starting something like this and you don't already have a system model, what scale of challenge is that for the company that's developing an in-silico
Okay,
model?
I think there are various levels of system models that you can do. So we were lucky to have Declan come in with his very well-developed patient model, and they had to essentially defeature their model a bit to adapt it to the test rig. Whereas it would be quite feasible. It'd be a decent body of work, but it would be quite feasible to start from a blank sheet of paper and work out your, continuity equations on a one-dimensional basis, or basically a few elements here, there, and everywhere, flow in, flow out. It would be feasible. It'd take you a little while, but it would be a feasible amount of work to do. And if this is in the context of developing a device, you'd have plenty of time to do that if you thought it was worth your effort.
Okay.
But that would be a much simpler model. It would just be sort of modeling a flow, a flow going in, flow going out here, a flow balance somewhere else. So yeah, I think it's feasible to start from scratch, but it would be a significant body of work to do. But then once you have the architecture of that done, it should be adaptable, fairly adaptable.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. So we've got some questions coming through in the chat. Comment on a question from me, Dan, who says, thanks for the great presentation. And he was wondering whether heat transfer has been considered in the numerical model. From your experience, is that a key factor in determining CO₂ concentration and rebreathing?
Good question. So I'll first of all answer that by saying we're coming back to the scope. So we had the ISO 17510, and we were looking to simulate a bench test rather than the physiology. So in that case, we haven't considered that. But yes, you're right. It is a that's how physiology works. When we breathe in, we breathe out at say 37 degrees and 5% carbon dioxide, and that will have an impact because air is an ideal gas. That will change the density of it, and so it will have an impact on the flow. I can't give you a feel on the scale of that influence, but yes. So we're simulating a test. The test differs from a person in a number of ways, and some of those were the profile that we used was sinusoidal rather than a more natural breathing profile that Declan spoke about. If we're exhaling, we'd be exhaling fully saturated moist air, and there'd be water vapor to consider, and the thermodynamics of that as well. So they will have an impact. I can't give you really quantify it, but our focus is on the bench test and replicating that in the scope of regulatory.
Thank you. So another comment saying thanks for a great talk from Michael, and a question. He was just wondering, what are the failure/fault cases you could try to look into, and would the models be able to capture them in their current form?
Another good question. So ISO 17510 does include some fault cases, and trying to remember them off the top of my head, but things like losing power, so you don't have the pressure applied, and I think breathing through a tube, at long tube, and yeah, anyway, there are fault cases described. We have excluded them from the scope of this project, so we didn't consider them at all. But yes, it would be possible to do that by altering the boundary conditions appropriately. So yes, it would. At least I'm speaking from the CFD point of view there. Maybe Declan, can you comment from your system model's point of view?
Yeah, I think there's no a priori problem with looking at different fault conditions, as long as you've got sensible data for what they result in, from the test rig.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I hope that answers, that does answer your question. So another question online, and then we'll go to Carl, who's got his hand up. So Sanjeev has commented, thanks for presenting this detailed work, and has asked a question. Sorry, they might have missed this, but there were two CO₂ boundary conditions. One of them was on the breathing inlet/outlet. Wouldn't this be over-constraining the simulation if you want to know how much CO₂ is being inhaled back? Maybe I misunderstood the larger outlet boundary condition enveloping the mask and the outlet valves with the jets. And I'm not sure if Wei Shang's response, the CO₂ outlet, is solely meant for reserved/re re-entering flow at standard flow setting, has resolved that query, or if anyone wants to elaborate on that.
Maybe I can do so. Wei Shang exactly told or answered, I think, what should be answered here. We need for each cell which corresponds with the outside of our fluid domain, where we don't have a mesh, where we don't have information, we need to put a condition in which flow would be for the case it will enter from there. So there is a possibility, if there is a defined pressure on the outlet and the pressure in the computational domain is lower, then there would be flow flowing into the computational domain from the outlet, and we just have to specify which conditions that will happen. And for this, the outlet CO₂ boundary condition was set. So just to have it defined and to have it somewhat sensible, and for that reason, the ambient CO₂ concentration was chosen.
Mm-hmm. And does anyone have any further comment or question on that particular point before we move on to Carl? No. In that case, Carl, are you happy to ask your question now?
Yep, sure. So I'm Carl Bass. I work at Bestpac. We make metered dose inhalers and dry powder inhalers, so kind of a similar field to the work you've done. Interesting talk. I think the your CFD models are accurate and pretty close to what you're predicting in the bench test, but they do kind of off differ by about kind of 2%. I think it was kind of 8% CO₂ versus 6 for the test bench and work. So I was just wondering kind of like where your gut feeling is at the moment, where that inaccuracy lies, and what kind of future work you've got planned out to kind of look at maybe different turbulence models and different model development to kind of close that gap a little bit.
Well, you've covered some of them there. So it's yes, we have an unsteady generalized K omega turbulence model in there at the moment. So there are several things. One would be mesh refinement and grid independence. Like we've put a lot of thought into the mesh, but we haven't done that a rigorous refinement, and we're potentially too coarse in some areas. So that needs to be done. And then there will be some of those uncertainty parameters. So turbulence would be one of them, and then there could be things like how closely are we actually representing the form of the model and geometrically? Like, we've made some good efforts to be about as close as we reasonably can be to it. But for instance, we haven't considered the change of shape and any the shape of the deforming parts of the mask as it was glued onto that facial profile and things like that. So we've made an effort to match the volumes. So we should be in the ballpark pretty closely, and but there could be some internal details that don't match and could influence the flow and hence mixing and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
So those are some areas of exploration that we could dive into.
Yeah. And then Declan, kind of a question for you on your system model. Is there capability in there to include particle transport and aerosols?
Very good question. We haven't done it yet, but it's an area that we're very interested in starting to look at, actually. It's an obvious sort of next step. So we've been very focused on just the ventilation aspects up to now, but there's an obvious sort of extension to the model looking at drug delivery and particle deposition, I think. That we'd be very interested in looking at, but not so far.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's all for me.
And if I may just add, Carl, there are also considerations on the accuracy of the measurement. So lab data will have its own uncertainty. So it's not perfect. So we need to consider that when comparing the values to whatever other models predict.
Yeah. So I get your test data was just one data point, or was it an average of multiple?
It was one. Like, we basically did a type test. We took an old mask and did a type test on it. And yes, so what Wei-Sheng actually has added a really good point, which I know when we had that whole list of credibility activities, some of those in there were ones about the uncertainty and the test side of it as well. And so we should consider that as well. And so that's another side of that balancing equation. So ideally, we'd have tolerance bounds around each of them and see how
you could get some error bars on your experimental data that nicely captures your CFD. So there you'd be right there. Cool. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks, Wei-Sheng.
Great. So another question has come in from Andrew Bath, who asks, how much computational power is consumed by the CFD modeling to simulate in what time scale?
Thank you, Andrew. So in that simulation that we showed, the CFD one, that was run on 36 cores on a cloud provider, and it ran for approximately a day, and our time step was held fixed at 1 millisecond. And we ran that for 3 breath cycles. So that's 12 seconds of simulation time. So that's 12,000 increments, and it took approximately a day.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Devaka. What kind of regulatory limitations do you have to face?
Is this something where Leon would like to jump in?
Do you want me to speak to that one?
Leon, please. Yes.
Please do.
No worries. So the team has done a really great job, and credit to them in terms of looking at what we would more or less consider one of the state-of-the-art standards, which is ASME V&V40. And so the team have run through their approach to that in terms of the model risk and many different aspects of the sort of credibility studies that would need to be done in this particular circumstance, noting this this whole project is about one particular test as part of one particular standard. So it's quite a limited scope. And I think that was done quite wisely by the team, I might add. So keeping things narrowly under controlled in controlled circumstances is a wise move when you're looking to make as much forwards progress as you can with this sort of simulation work. So I think that's another thing that's been done wisely here. From the regulatory perspective, I think the team's also outlined the sorts of credibility work that still needs to be done. Tejas ran through that in a fair amount of detail. So regulators will have their own views on what the model risk is. I tend to agree with the team, though, for this. I want to be crystal clear with that. I tend to agree with the team here for this particular piece of work. I agree with their model risk. And then the amount of credibility work that needs to be done depends on the facets of the different aspects of the model in exactly the way that Tejas ran through in the presentation. And that's where I'll acknowledge perhaps different regulators might have different views about exactly where those things would stand. But we'd want to see the balance of those credibility studies completed exactly as is planned by the team in terms of the further work. Look, I hope that answers your question.
I have a problem here, a technical problem. May I ask my question directly? Andrew, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I'm also on the standard size. I'm responsible for this document at all, together with Andrew, who is obviously located right now in Sydney. I'm located in Berlin right now. But just as a short remark, the latest edition, the second edition of this document was just published last month. Just for your information, there is not really technical changes with regard to what we have done. That's not the problem. There are some other issues which need to be done on the thing. But the question raises from all what you have done, and from that, I assume, and discussing about the regulators is usually quite helpful if something like this is mentioned somewhere in the relevant document in the ISO/IC Joint Working Group document as a kind of option or something. Is there intention from your side to do something to provide us information to get it included in the next revision or whenever an amendment is done or whatever situation? What is the intention from your side?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how well I can answer it. I'll attempt. Maybe Tejas might be able to add something, but in general, I think we are in favor of supporting simulation results work as evidence for regulatory submissions. And that's why we've been involved in this project, and hope that this can form part of the landscape to promote that. So I think we would like to progress that. I'm speaking from my point of view. I'm speaking personally, not as a company representative at this point. So I don't have a formal position on that, but we do want to improve simulation, improve the work we do all the time. It will lead to better products, better processes, and what that path is in the short term and long term, I'm not sure, but opening more opportunities for high quality data that can provide understanding as well as just a number can be really valuable. And like, I know we use the concept here of a surrogate model where it might be sort of the sole information. That doesn't have to be the case. The context you choose, it might be supported alongside something. So maybe it's used to identify a worst case, and then you minimize your testing, but you back it up with simulation to say why you're minimizing your testing. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the specific question of, I guess, inputs to the next version of the standard. Maybe Andrew might have a comment on that, or maybe that's something we need to have a discussion about.
No, I assume we will have a discussion in January. We have a meeting here in Germany, end of January, and I assume, Andrew, we will have a discussion on these issues. But I'm thinking about really on more the personalized mask in the future. And if you look for the personalized, you need also to follow some regulatory requirements to make sure that there is no risk involved and so on. And maybe this is also a tool to use this to ensure that there is no problem with this personalized mask in the future.
My personal opinion is that I see sort of In-Silico V&V and regulatory work as a, I'm not necessarily saying necessary, but I see that as an enabler for personalized medicine and personalized devices. The bench testing will be impractical on things that don't exist. If something's personalized or customized somehow. So I do see this as being an enabler for that future. And I think that's one of the reasons I think it's an important body of work to encourage, and it's an exciting path for the future.
Can I make a comment quickly? Two parts. One is to first sort of in principle agree with you there, Andrew, and certainly if anyone's interested in bringing sort of personalized devices to the TGA for an application, particularly if it's for TGA conformity assessment certification, I would thoroughly encourage you to engage a regulatory submission, a meeting with us prior to submitting your application or your regulatory submission. So a pre-submission meeting. We have a few different types of pre-submission meetings. And if folks are interested in using this sort of simulation work, and this relates to Divika's question earlier, I would thoroughly encourage you to engage with us early so that we can give you early feedback on the approach that could be taken. As this project is sort of outlined here, we can give people early feedback on the approach that they're proposing to take if they're wanting to use simulation in lieu of any bench testing, and in particular for personalized sort of devices.
Can I add a personal comment, sort of echoing what you're saying there? Recently, I was able to go to a conference in the US and with regulators, MDIC, Medical Device Innovation Consortium. Anyway, a lot of the focus was about simulation for regulatory purposes. And one of the key takeaways I had from the conference, and particularly from people, say, from the FDA who spoke there, was exactly that. Meet with them early, upfront, plan your approach. And that was probably one of the key takeaways I had from that. It matches up exactly with your comment.
Yeah, I think in some sense, laying out the standard and the process would help the regulators, help the manufacturers, right? So I think in that sense, indirectly,
absolutely,
the VNV40 or whatever is being written by ISO or whoever it may be, will sort of make that almost a natural process for regulators to understand, and as well as for manufacturers to understand what they need to get it through the market. It has been seen with like cardiological or orthopedic applications already, which is probably a lot more mature in the use of computational methods compared to our pilot. So I would say that that's an ongoing process, and I think it has to be driven through the standard where there is harmonization almost of the understanding from the regulatory aspect as well as the manufacturer to understand what's needed. and what is sufficient. I think the credibility assessment sort of plays a huge role in that, which is why you have so many points, so many sections in the VNV 40, because that's essentially you convincing the regulator that we've actually done all of this. Yeah, I think that's my 2 cents about sort of how it all fits in. Yeah.
Joyce, you've got your hand up. Did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I found this discussion extremely interesting. For those who are not aware, I'm the lead on Work Package 2 of the CEiRSI project, and we're working on regulatory and governance and standards related issues. And part of my day job, I'm a member of the Regulatory Horizons Council in the UK, where we're looking at the government's new pro-innovation regulation approach. And I'm aware that in many cases, there's a need for more integrated co-development of regulations and standards around some of these new technologies. And I wonder if that is something that's appreciated here, that it's understood as being part of the future development, and who's talking about it and how is it evolving, because that's one of the things we should be thinking about in the next phase of CEiRSI when it goes ahead.
Yes, I totally agree. I think a standard is sort of the logical destination we should be looking for, considering all of these pilots together and understanding that has been developed through these different airlocks, where regulators are involved, academics are involved, the basic sciences and the industry as well, looking at how to bring everything together. Yeah, absolutely.
And if anybody else on the call has got ideas in this area that they would like to pass on to us for our thinking for the next phase of CEiRSI, I'd be grateful for any emails that you wanted to send. Thank you.
And from my side, from German side, and also from the international side, I'm the convener of the joint working group. They are responsible for this document. I'm happy to that some of your people join the team and come to us and explain to us and for the future and what we can do is to support this issue for the regulatory world. And I know from my many years of experience that helps quite a lot usually to get it done with regulators. But also what I have to say especially from the German side, we have also some issues with reimbursement of these things. And this is also very helpful to have a standard. Someone mentioned this as an option in the standard. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to get it reimbursed here. That's also another point, which is it's not just regulatory.
Yeah. Yes.
And
well,
Andrew knows it.
exciting.
Andrew knows it quite well as from Sydney. I assume he is still there and can surely confirm this.
I assume you're talking about
can we
the other
look
Andrew.
at
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
can we look at neutralizing the carbon dioxide that is released?
Sorry, so you're wondering, can we neutralize or absorb it?
Yeah, absorb it. Yeah, absorb or dissipate that. Yeah.
Sort of like it. Okay, so the device itself traditionally has simple hole vents. It would be not to say someone can't do something that has some sort of a CO2 scrubber or something in it, but we need to get rid of carbon dioxide somehow.
Yeah.
The device we've chosen to look at is a standard CPAP mask with which has essentially orifice vents in it to both, excuse me, maintain pressure and provide a controlled exhaust flow to remove this carbon dioxide. So we're tracking using the species transport to track the rebreathing and the venting in this case. So is your question about having a product that has some active ingredient in it that will absorb the CO2? So I'd say that's out of scope of what we're looking for at the moment, but there is no reason that someone couldn't make it, but you would then have to jump through all of the regulatory hoops and deal with demonstrating that you are dealing with the carbon dioxide somehow. So I guess you could do it. It'd be a lot of work.
Can we put something in the mask where it can absorb the carbon dioxide or something? Activated material.
Something like a scuba diving scrubber or something like that.
Yeah. So it can absorb the carbon dioxide.
So nice thought.
Interesting.
Sorry?
I think there are some design considerations that need to take place.
That need to
be beyond just the CO2. There might be bio-C, and there's a whole new level that will open up. I think Leon might be able to comment. So
doesn't mean it can't be done, but
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Nice presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a good time to wrap up, unless anyone has any more questions. Andrew, did you have any closing remarks?
Well, mainly just ones of thanks again. So thank you to the team. Thank you to yourself, Alex, and others from the CEiRSI project who supported it and gave their advice at times. And thank you to everyone who joined in, listened, and commented. Just thank you, everyone, and hope you found it interesting. I did. And that's probably all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to add, I want to thank Andrew for sort of picking this up, and everyone on the team, of course, but Andrew sort of leading the whole CFT aspect and doing all this with me. Thanks, Andrew, for actually picking up all the heavy lifting for the CFD side. And
well, it's not just me. It's not just me. Like there's some.
And Wei Sheng and Hendrik and everyone.
has a vast amount of experience there, and and Hendrik also like did a lot of that work. It really was a team effort, and everyone has their slightly different experience levels and things that they've done, and everyone brought different aspects to it. And then we had that both in one sense within the, say, that CFD project where we had Wei Sheng, Hendrik, myself, and whatever, doing various bits of it. But then we also had it on a larger sense with being able to have Declan and Hussein join us and open up the branch of doing the system modeling as well. So I think, everyone brought their skills to it and their time, and thank you. I guess you now need to write the report and do those things.
And Alex isn't here, but I would like to thank Alex as well. So this whole thing started up as sort of a conversation we had more than a year ago, and here we are. And I'll make sure to tell him as well, and hope he catches the recording. So thanks.
Yeah, definitely. We'll pass on that thanks, and just want to say thank you to the team and to everyone who attended this presentation. It's been great to see everyone's efforts come to fruition. Just one final point from me. If anyone is free tomorrow at 2 p.m. UK time, I really doubt it, but everyone in Australia, we've got another pilot panel session running tomorrow on the use of In-Silico models in radiotherapy. But as always, all panel sessions will be uploaded to the UK CEiRSI YouTube. So with that said, everyone have a nice rest of your day or a nice sleep, depending on where you're from, and thank you so much.